Muses of Mythology is a spoiler-heavy podcast.
That's an understatement.
We're going to discuss not just the events of this book, but the Rhineverse as a whole, and really anything that we feel is relevant. You can find full spoiler warnings in the show notes.
It's like that's like top on the list if you're a time traveler classicist. It's like, all right.
Gonna go listen to this? Take a tape recorder? Why did I say tape recorder? If you have a time machine, you probably have more than cassettes.
Oh yeah. No, you gotta get that recorder in there. I mean, like, what are they not gonna think you're a witch for, you know? Like,
these were all crafted by Hephaestus.
honestly though.
It's beyond your comprehension. Don't worry about it.
Don't worry about it. Can you just sing again?
Here's a Cool Ranch Dorito. I want you to eat it for me real quick. Just really quick, dude.
Welcome to Muses of Mythology, a podcast where we explore how ancient myths become part of modern pop culture through the lens of Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson and the Olympian series. This is Story 67, the Iliad. I'm your co-host and podcasting muse, Darien Smart. Joining me is my co-host and brother, DJ.
How's everybody doing today? I am the muse of epics. We do with anything epic, whether it be Spore, Beowulf, the Odyssey, and the Iliad. We are wonderful here.
Did you say Spore?
I said Spore, yeah.
Okay, well, I need to muse around about that in the garden for a minute.
Absolutely.
DJ.
Yeah.
This is a big one.
That it is.
It's the Iliad. It's one of the big ones.
Iliad.
I once heard that when you get into the field of like Greek classical studies, you're either an Odyssey kid or you're an Iliad kid.
Yeah.
And good news for us, I found us an Iliad kid.
Great. I feel like that straight up comes from whichever one you're exposed to first.
Okay, well, we'll find out in a second.
That's not true.
Let me introduce the Iliad.
Well,
yeah, wow, she had to talk because you were so wrong.
I know. Crazy.
Not necessarily true.
We are joined today by co-host of the Monster Donut podcast, classic scholar-ish, Emily Garber.
Yes. I'm called that because I have a bachelor's degree in Greek and Latin, but I feel like most actual classic scholars would not consider that qualified enough. However, I have a lot of special interests in this and also an actual degree. So that's where I'm at.
Yes. No, Emily is for real in this whole thing. Not just we like it for real.
Yeah.
Well, liking is valid. You can still do a lot of research for fun. You don't have to have a professor, cause you psychological damage to, be an expert in this stuff.
This is a very good point. I feel like we are more emotionally sound from just doing it for podcast fun than for grade that we paid for.
I don't think I'd be getting anything more than like a D on some of the shit that I've said on this podcast.
Well, on the podcast? No, DJ, I think you've made some really insightful things. I feel like you have
the teacher would look at me like a fool.
It depends on the teacher. I also think it depends on whether or not you did the goddamn homework.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, 100%.
Emily, will you expound on the comment you made earlier regarding Iliad kids?
I was going to say, do you say you heard it from somewhere, or did you hear it from me?
It was you. It was you specifically. We were sitting having dessert in New York. Yeah.
So I love that story because it's not mine though, it's my friend's, but basically a friend of mine expressed to a professor of ours right at the beginning of our college career that she was interested in pursuing classics, and that professor immediately said, well, there's Iliad people and there's Odyssey people, and you have to pick one. Like, that was the first introduction to the field. And it is kind of true. When you talk to other classicists, you'll sort of get a feel. You'll kind of start to realize, like, oh, you're an Odyssey person, aren't you? Or like, oh, you're an Iliad people. You're like me.
You're like me.
That being said, they're both amazing poems, and I think everyone generally in classics is a fan of both. I don't think I've come across any Homer haters. I'm sure they're out there.
Oh, positive, of course.
But generally, the Odyssey as a story is a lot more about like the journey and the adventure story, and I feel like a lot of people, it's definitely, not to sound like this is probably just the beginning, but it sounds a little pretentious, but it's true. It's better in English because of that.
Oh, no. Can you elaborate on that? What do you mean by, like, as in?
So by nature of Greek epic poetry, the Iliad is, both of them have a lot of repetition as part of the way they're composed, just because that's just like a convention of the genre. They're originally like oral poems, so you'd have to memorize them all as a bard. And so having like repetitive phrases, like you might have noticed them even in translations you've read. There's all these like recurring like epithets of different characters, or even like whole scenes sometimes that are repeated. And that's just because of the way the poems were composed. And I think it adds something really cool to the work. But the Odyssey, because it has a lot more different like episodes in it. Like it's not just, this one war where everyone's sitting in the same place at the whole time, because there's so much variation in it. And there's also like two completely different storylines happening. I think it's just better because I think even the like strongest Iliad stan at some point is going to be like, oh my God, another Aristea. Okay. Like, when reading through the Iliad. And it's also because they were never intended to be like read or consumed like all at once.
Yeah.
In the oral tradition, like what would happen is a bard would come into town and be like, oh, hey, I'm in this town and this hero is from this town. Let me tell you the part of the Iliad or the Odyssey that's about this hero. Or like, let me tell you that at the time Odysseus fought Polyphemus. Or like, let me tell you about the time like Hector fought Achilles, like they would always be parts of it.
And it'd be communal. Like you wouldn't just be sitting there alone with it. It'd be in a group with an audience
it would
reacting.
be performed. Usually with music too.
Whoa. I never think about that. Why are you an Iliad person?
The poetry is just so good. Like, the Odyssey is great. There's some really great passages in it, but man, the Iliad, the poetry of it is just so incredible. And I think the story of the Iliad, to me, is more powerful. Because the thing about the Odyssey is it really, like, it's also a very powerful story about, like, Odysseus as a character. But the Iliad is really about, like, mortals wrestling with like all of these huge themes of like their relationships with the gods and glory, and it just feels so like it's so timeless. Like the Odyssey is also timeless, but the Iliad really feels like thematically like there's a reason why this has been around for so long.
Yeah, I definitely, in doing just the podcast and like citing passages from the Iliad as like reference to the topics we've talked about recently, some of them are just like so killer. Like
They're so good.
They just hit. Even like I really enjoyed the Odyssey, and both the translations we have referenced on the show are by Emily Wilson, so it's not like, oh, this translation was just better. But damn, when Patroclus like calls out Hector when he's dying, and he's like, "Nah, motherfucker, you didn't kill me, but my boyfriend's gonna kill you." Like that chills.
That's my favorite part. I love
that. So good.
And the other thing that's so cool, right, is the exact word. Like, again, I bring up like type scenes. So the exact wording and description of Patroclus dying is that like stanza is like the exact same description of Hector dying. Like it's that. It's just like there's so many cool connections that are just so good.
Nice.
Like we call that the death of the hero, and like that description in of itself is my favorite passage in the Iliad, and it's so pretty. Like. The language of Homer is what's kind of interesting is the language of Homer in many ways. Like you learn that's like actually if you're studying Greek, that's going to be one of the first like big boy texts you look at, which might seem kind of strange because usually poetry is always a little bit more difficult to read than prose. The thing is, it's like it was composed to like be performed and understood by like a general populace, so it's not like that complex in terms of like the way the sentences are put together. And yet, like, the ways and, like, the wording and the descriptions are all just so, like, stark, but, like, so creative in the way that it's all put together. Like, you can sort of feel, like, the epicness of the story just in, like, the way the narrative voice describes it. Like, I just read the Emily Wilson Iliad translation for the first time. And you really feel like whenever the narrator is like, and then this happened, like, as you know, a thing, like, as you milk this isn't a real line, but like, as you like, as a wolf comes into your flock of sheep at night, where it's like clear, like you're describing these things that would be unfathomable to the average person in this time. Just with these kinds of like really cool extended like metaphors or similes. The passage I'm talking about is, Let me see if I can do it from memory. I did translate this once upon a time, so I use my own translation for it.
That's so cool.
He's been taunting Hector, and then finally the wounds overpower him, and his last sigh is not only him like exhaling like his life force out of his body, because the Greek word psyche, which is psyche, means like life or life's breath or soul. Like those are sort of three different definitions we have for it in English.
Oh.
This idea of like the breath is what is sort of generates your life is kind of a thing in ancient Greek. So it's like you're exhaling out your life force.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the same time, it's a sigh of lament, like lamenting your like lost youth, your lost like strength.
Oh, uh-huh.
And then it just exhales, and then it goes down to Hades. Like just this beautiful sweeping image that picks up these dual meaning and descriptions at once, and then and it just travels through the line like the soul. Like it's just so good.
No, that kind of like writing that can do both is rich and incredible.
Reading the Iliad in particular taught me a lot about writing, because it taught me a lot about how you can use the arrangement of words to also be part of the language.
Mm-hmm.
Like which words go next to each other, and which, like, can you stack a sentence in a way that has a journey like that?
Oh, yeah.
Like there's like a cool part it's in there a bunch of different times, because again it's repetitive, because like poets would just be describing like, oh yeah, and then this warrior got up.
It's like a fairy tale where they'll say the same.
Yeah exactly. And like there's a great description that's used all the time where they throw the spear, and the spear, it's casting a long shadow, and then a bunch of other stuff goes on, and then it hits. And then, because in Greek, the verb is at the end. So the impact, the spear hitting the shield, like, it's like shivering through the air, casting a long shadow, and then making impact with the verb, which is like the spear hits him.
Uh-huh.
And then it like quivers in the shield. It's just like it's so good.
Evocative. It sounds like. Yeah.
It's evocative and just like paints this gorgeous, like it just paints these really cool, like most of the descriptions you see as well, just like the descriptions are not like typical adjectives. They're like ones that bring up a completely different aspect of something that's unrelated or like related in a very cool way, and just paints like this really broad, beautiful like image of an entire scene.
So, I recognize this isn't a good question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Who wrote this? Like Homer, yeah, but the thing we have, that text that is translated to be the Emily Wilson's translation of the Iliad or whatever we have, like what is that, and how much weight do we put on it as this is the thing that the bards were actually saying from town to town?
Yeah, that's a great question. The answer is we will never know.
Stellar.
But it was probably not one person.
Yeah.
Again, like I said, it's like from an oral tradition, which means generally like bards and poets would learn either portions or the entirety of these texts, effectively memorizing them. But like because of the way they're written, like I said, they can kind of like compose them and piece them together and like kind of freestyle if you need to. Like if you forget a part, you'll be like, oh, and then swift-footed Achilles did this, I guess.
Yep.
The current working theory. So the version of the Iliad and the Odyssey we have now, we estimate was written down probably around like 800, 700 BC.
Oh, okay.
Which would have been during what we call like the Dark Ages or the Archaic period.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually an entire separate topic of like when does this story take place, which is really interesting.
Not definitely a question I'm actually going to ask.
Yeah, that's a separate question.
I'm assuming a goofy question, but
we won't talk about that yet.
Yeah. We'll circle back.
So that we know is when it was probably written down and recorded. That being said, we know there was several hundred years before this time where it probably was being performed. And one of the interesting things about the way it's written is it's actually not written in a specific dialect of Greek. It's written in a mishmash. It's what we call Homeric Greek because it's like its own completely different style because it takes a few different dialects of Greek and like mashes them together. And the kind of working theory why that is because there's so many different poets writing different sections that's just kind of what happened.
Just someone was like, I'm going to compile all my favorites.
Yeah. And another Another one I've heard, another theory, or maybe these two can coexist as well, is that since it was performed so widely, they like put everything in all of the dialects so that everyone could kind of understand most of it.
It's just like switching accents while performing something.
Yeah, like switching dialects. It's sort of like mashing up like
English, Australian, and American.
That'd be a very bold choice.
Yeah, but it's not even like accents. It's like completely different grammatical forms of the words.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so yeah, it's
weird.
Yeah, so it's a little bizarre. Like I feel like it'd be like if you're switching back and forth between AAVE and English, for example, where it's like sometimes the words, like sometimes they're using the grammar of one, and sometimes it's just like
yeah. It feels like if that's the reason, it's like when Disney's like, we want to make a song for the new millennium. Let's smash everything together and make one song for the world. And it's like, that's not, I don't think that was a real thing. That's not what we did over here. That's probably not it.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mess, but it's kind of cool. And it gives it its own distinct identity.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of other of the quote unquote Homeric works, like the Homeric hymns, are called that because they're written in that dialect also.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. Thank you for teaching me why that's a thing I see a lot, but don't fully understand why that's a thing.
So
didn't let myself go down that rabbit hole.
Is sort of the name we have given more to the style than necessarily an author.
Oh.
I think some ancient authors did believe Homer was a real person. There's like a blind bard character in the Odyssey that a lot of people like think was Homer or something, like a self-insert. I was reading, apparently Herodotus was like, oh yeah, Homer was a real person, and like went to the Oracle of Dodona to figure out when the Iliad and the Odyssey took place. Very funny.
I love that. I love that information that you've given me. I also love the idea that the ancients were like, yeah, Homer, this guy we deeply respect, he did self-insert, and that's really cool, actually, and not something that we should mock. So shout out to all the fanfic writers out there. You know who you are.
It's always existed, man. It has always existed.
It's the way humans tell stories.
Yeah, there's actually a whole bunch of other texts that are myths surrounding the Trojan War that are not Homeric epics.
Yeah.
That also would have been existing at this time and continue to exist throughout antiquity. One of the really frustrating things about studying classics is there's so many things that like we know for a fact this text existed, and we know for a fact it probably even lasted like all the way through the Roman Empire, but we don't have it.
No, so
people will just like quote it or like cite it. So we'll have like quotes.
We know it's real, but we've talked. Yeah, that's come up, something we talked about before, where it's like, all right, so we know this thing definitely existed because other people talked about it. No, what it actually said, I have no idea. But we're going to talk about Prometheus for a little bit, so bear with me. We're going to talk about what we think it said about Prometheus in this thing. Hold on.
And some of them, like, there's reasons why they don't exist, and others it's just like, just bad luck.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that there were other works about the Trojan War outside of like the Homeric stuff. Is that where we get the story of Achilles having to be disguised as a woman to try to get out of the war and then dying with an arrow shot? Because I was shocked to learn that arrow thing is not in the Iliad when I realized. I'm like, that's the first thing I learned about Achilles, is he had a bad heel. And yet you're going to tell me that that's not in the book that I thought was about Achilles? No, because it's not about Achilles, actually.
Yeah, I'd have to double check. I think that's one of the other texts, although I'm not 100% sure. That particular one of him, it's mentioned that he's got a son in the Iliad. That's a thing.
Yeah.
But that particular story of him disguising himself as a woman might have been Roman. I'm not 100% on
Was it Ovid the hack?
How dare you besmirch the name of Ovid?
That's my running gag. I have no reason to do it.
How dare you? Why is he a hack?
I think he took a lot of things that were Greek and then added some bullshit to it. I'm looking at you, Medusa.
I mean, his book is called The Metamorphosis. Like, he was working on a theme.
Yeah. No, it's fine. It's fine. But also, I think a couple of her stories are just really similar to earlier things he had written in the same thing. Anyway, But
that's kind of like calling out the joke and then doing the joke anyway.
Well, I will say in defense of Ovid, first of all.
Oh, no. You're the first one to defend Ovid because you know more than me. Everyone else just lets me call him a hack and we keep rolling. I made a mistake.
I call Virgil a hack and I mean it. So the thing about Ovid was he's actually one of the reasons we have some of those myths in the first place. So him regurgitating stories, while yes, probably is true, is actually the reason why we even have them in the first place for some of them.
Understand.
So that's good. Also, like, again, I get into the poetry of it all, but Roman poetry, like, generally is just not good, especially Roman epic poetry, because
I'm so happy right now.
It's bad. It's just bad. Like, some of it's good. But the thing is, what happened
I could see in your eyes, like, you were trying to think of an example that is good, and then you're just like, I'm going to move on.
Well, that's the thing. It's Ovid. Ovid is actually good.
Damn it. I'm taking this is going to the Patreon. No one else is going to hear this. I am defending myself. I will continue my bit. No.
So this is actually ties back to the Iliad, though, because most upper class Romans...
I have to leave it in.
Most upper class Romans were educated. A lot of them would get sent to get educated in Greece because at the time, especially in the time of the Republic and the late Republic, they thought that like the Greeks, they sort of had more of a handle on that kind of thing. So they'd send their kids off. And so they'd learn Greek and Latin. And what kind of ended up happening was the Greek literature, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, were held up as like some of like really like the best works of literature by the Romans. So what they actually did was they started to model their epic poetry off of the Greek. Specifically, they modeled their meter off of the Greek meter, dactylic hexameter, which is what the Iliad and the Odyssey are written in. If that's a big crazy word, it's like iambic pentameter, right? It's like pentameter, 5 meters of iambs, which are stressed, unstressed. Dactylic hexameter, it's the same kind of word. There's 6 feet, and it's dactyls. So it's a long, short, short, or there'll be spondees of long, long. The thing is that, like, that's the Greek meter. So that'd be like writing French in iambic pentameter. Like, it just, like, you can do it.
But should you?
Is it gonna be that amazing unless you're, like, really good?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's like other Latin meters like Saturnian that are way better. Like you read something, but like no one writes in them because they're like, oh no, I'm gonna be like the Greeks. I'm gonna be like,
gotta be like,
Homer, which is an ongoing theme for the rest of Western civilization.
Hey, Emily said the word.
Everyone's like, oh my god, I'm just like Achilles. I'm just like the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Yep,
that's a recurring theme. Ovid is one of the few I've seen who actually be able to pull it off. Versus like Virgil, no.
All right, so this is a formal apology to Ovid. I'm sorry I said it once, thought it was funny, and kept saying it. Emily, can I call Virgil a hack? I feel like I need this.
Yeah, I call Virgil a hack literally every episode of Monster Donut. I hate that man.
Cool. We should circle back. I'm gonna ask you specifically about it when I'm on Tyrants Tomb on Sunday. Just completely derail and be like, why do we hate Virgil? Educate me. But we can't do that here.
I mean, that's like the main thing is it's that. Also, like Aeneas sucks. But anyway.
Aeneas does suck. I don't care for him. But here, so what I'm hearing is the things about Achilles that are not from the Iliad were maybe from the Romans.
Yeah, or the and again, we also like don't know. We have some idea, but not a complete idea of of the other stories the Romans and the Greeks would have had access to, right? So even if it's like a Roman wrote it down for the first time, that's not necessarily even the first time it was written down. It's just like what we have.
Bet. Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
You know, like it's sort of like anyone's guess and kind of a puzzle. It's why we know, like, for example, there's like different versions of different myths, and there's like a lot of, we just know that we've lost so much, basically. So we kind of have to work off our best guesses as to like what the most original versions of things are, or like what we have, and yeah.
Okay. I have one more question that's more like a broad putting context to the Iliad as a thing that exists in our world and history before I think we pivot into the Iliad itself as a story. Hey, what did this mean to people when they were hearing it? Like, was it history? Was it fantasy? Was it... I saw something somewhere that was like they were written, the Iliad and the Odyssey, these stories were written to try to explain a civilization that the Greeks didn't have anymore, but had artifacts about. Did I hear that from you, maybe?
It's definitely possible that was from me, because that is true.
Interesting. Okay, yeah.
So I think, like, what did they get out of it is sort of the same question as, like, when does the story take place and who is it about?
Okay.
The short version is, I mean, for the average person in archaic Greece who would have been hearing a bard sing about it, they're hearing a story about, you know, their kinsmen. They're hearing a story about a time of heroes. It's like the myths, you know, they're like,
Mhm.
oh, but the myths, not in an abstract sense, but the myths of like, yeah, these people, like there's a part in the Iliad that's called the Catalogue of Ships. That if anyone has tried to read the Iliad, you'll know what I'm talking about, because that's usually a part where I feel like a lot of people might put it down, because it's a very extended list of all of these names and peoples and places.
Oh my God, it's like the Book of Genesis.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just, again, the purpose of the Catalogue of Ships is like, if you're telling the story in a room, you could be like, and then this guy was there from here. You know,
Everyone's
like,
like, oh!
these are the peoples of your forefathers.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that is really interesting about the Catalogue of Ships is that that's a big piece of evidence to point to who the Iliad is about, because as far as we can tell, that actually corresponds to a Bronze Age political breakdown of Greece, as opposed to a later one with like archaic or classical. For those who are not familiar, there's different periods.
Vocabs. Yeah. No, that's great. Please. That's something
Iliad and the Odyssey would have been written down in like 800 BC. That's like archaic period. That's because basically there's a big cataclysmic event that we call the Bronze Age collapse. Now, it happened over a period of several hundred years and was definitely not like one major event, but
an asteroid didn't strike the area and kill everyone. Like this was just
There was a series of cataclysmic events that happened that created, there was basically this huge thriving trade network in the Mediterranean that was done. It's the ancient Egyptians, the Cypriot people, the Hittites in Turkey, modern day Turkey, you know, Greece, and a bunch of other peoples were all kind of in this really rich, thriving trade network. And a series of cataclysmic things happened that caused that entire infrastructure to collapse. And that's why we call it Dark Ages, because they sort of all lost contact. There was a bit of a regression in technology. And out of that darkness, out of that sort of Dark Ages, and that one, we date it to around like 1200, 1100 BC, which for context to anybody, Socrates was like 400 BC. So remember, we're counting backwards. So this is like a long time before Socrates.
Yeah, like 800 years?
Yeah, just about. And so that Dark Ages that kind of came out afterwards is sort of like the Middle Ages, right? Where the Roman Empire collapsed and there's like a bunch, like we lost all of these connections and trade networks. People kind of regressed and then we kind of came out of it. So it's the same thing. And then the classical period in Greece was around like 400 BC. And that's when we kind of get to like what we think of ancient Greece. That's the period. Like you're thinking like Athens and Sparta.
But that's not the period where these stories were created or even like set.
Yes. So the stories we think were created around 1100 to 800 period. Although they might have been started earlier. We just don't know. But we are pretty sure they are set in the Mycenaean period, which would have been around like maybe 1200 BC. Could have been earlier than that. I would guess they're set later, just because if you take the Iliad and the Odyssey together, it sort of feels like the epic culmination of this like age of heroes and mythology. And it does sort of feel like a society on the brink of collapse. Yeah,
things don't feel like they're gonna, like, even it's like, oh, they won the war and Odysseus eventually got home, and it's like, yeah, but doesn't this feel like things aren't good? Like the last moments of like, hey, it worked out, and you're just like, but at what cost?
Yeah, like by the end of the Odyssey, almost all of the great leaders in the Iliad are just dead. Like Odysseus is alive, and like Menelaus, and that's it. Like,
and that really gone. Menelaus, we're gonna say Menelaus is the guy we were like, you and your wife, Helen. I'm gonna name her by name. Obviously, it's Helen. Yeah.
I saw a joke when Avengers, like, was it Endgame or something came out, where someone was like the most epic crossover event in history, and someone like reposted that meme, but it was like with the Iliad. And it's just like very accurate. Like they're like taking all these characters from these stories, or like sons of characters from these like great myth stories, and they're like mashing them all together. Like, that's what it is. It feels like this culmination of, like, all of this stuff and being like, yeah, this is, like, the height of this. This is the climax.
And then it all went down the hill from here, just like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Please note, we are recording this before we are going to see the Marvels, which I hope is good. I need it to be good. Okay, so that, I'm sure we could do many hours on just trying to grasp you trying to teach us any sort of actual grasp context
this is
of
what
this
I'm saying. I
as a thing that
talk a lot.
exists.
I have a lot to say.
No, good. And also, because I also, every time you say a thing, I'm like, oh, here's another question I want to ask about like this, not even as what we do, which is story, but as thing that exists as a culture and a physical thing. But we need to talk about story.
I will say one last thing, though, that I should talk. This just because it is one of the coolest pieces of information ever, and it makes me like freak out every time. And I think it's also important. It's kind of sheds a cool light on a lot of the Iliad.
Mm-hmm.
Again, we think this was written about a period of time, the Mycenaean era, that would have been gone by the time the whole culture and civilizations, they would have been gone by the time the poets are composing these stories. But I think something we might forget living so far forward from there is that while they didn't have those civilizations around them thriving, what they did have were their ruins.
Oh, mm-hmm.
So something I noticed again on my reread of the Iliad, like recently, was just how much of like time is spent into talking about the objects and the things they have, because they would have been able to go to the citadel. Like the citadel of Mycenae is still there. Like you can still go there, and they would have been able to go to the citadel. Well, we call it a megaron, but I'll say citadel of Mycenae, and like just walk around it. Like it's just abandoned, empty, like ghost of a palace. Like kind of like you'll see like
so cool and spooky.
Yeah, and then they would have like wall paintings on the walls. And they would have like, you know, discarded objects everywhere. They would have like the shields, the helmets. Like there is so much there that like the average Greek person would have been able to interact with. Like, you know, even if you live in a village, like maybe there's like a random like Mycenaean palace down the, you know, up a hill or something that you could go climb up. And that is something that is kind of also important to keep in mind, I think, when thinking about the Iliad and the Odyssey as cultural elements, because it's not just a cultural memory of stories. There's also like a tactile element to it.
Yeah, and you mentioned that like technology regressed during the Dark Ages, and the things they would have been seeing were things that they couldn't have necessarily recreated themselves at that time?
Yeah, for some of them. I think there's definitely a memory of a more technologically advanced time. So like the myth of Atlantis, we think, was based on the Cretan, the Minoan. We think was based on Santorini, specifically like the Minoan stronghold at Thera. Which, by the way, if you're ever on Santorini, an underrated archaeological site is Akrotiri, which is like Pompeii, but like Bronze Age Pompeii.
Oh.
So it's like volcanic eruption buried an entire city, but like in like 1600 BC.
That's really cool.
That's
it's
awesome.
Sick.
Why do we only talk about Pompeii?
Well, it's fine.
Okay.
But
we can't get into that right now. Not what this episode is about.
Yeah, so we think like the cultural memory of Atlantis, that civilization, comes from that. And so there's definitely like elements of it that we see. But also the thing with the Iliad and the Odyssey is, again, most of them are composed and written by people not living in that time. So there's a lot of elements of technology they might have like seen, but not really known what it was or how it worked, which is another reason why we know that it wasn't written in those times. Because there's certain ways like chariots are described being used in battle where you're like, that's not how chariots work in battle.
Like, no, wrong.
Yeah, or certain things where it's like, that's not how that works. Like, that's not really how that would go. This is more of a reflection of the society in which it's being told, not the one it would have been before.
Not what it was. It'd be like if someone was trying to write World War II, a story about World War II, but had no idea how any of the weapons actually worked and just had the things that were there.
Yeah.
I use World War II because it's a war, not necessarily like there was a war, a lot of the Trojan War being real, but just that's where my brain was at.
Yeah.
Hey, did the Trojan War actually happen?
Great question.
Okay, was Troy real? Where's the wall at, Emily?
There's an archaeological site we have found that we think might have been Troy, but I keep saying we like I was there.
Wait, you get to speak for the classic scholar Ishis?
Yeah, so it's in Turkey. The thing is, the guy that discovered, his name is Heinrich Schliemann. He was kind of terrible. The German archaeologist. And this was back in like the Wild West of archaeology, where basically there were a bunch of people in the mid to late 1800s, into even like the 1920s, where they were just like basically gentlemen. Like they're independently wealthy aristocrats from particularly like France, England, Germany, where they'd grown up learning the classics, and they were like, hey, I've got all this money. What if I just like went to Greece and started digging? And the government at the time were like, sure. Yeah, you're going to pay me a lot of money?
Man.
Sure, whatever. And so they'd go in and they'd be like, oh my God. Did they go and they'd be like, well, obviously the Iliad's the lowest layer. And so what Heinrich Schliemann did was he was like, let me dynamite down to the first layer of this site we found that we think is Troy.
You told me this story when I was in New York, and I'm still so distressed to hear it.
Yeah, and he like found all of these like he found all this like jewelry and stuff, and he was like, oh my God, the treasure of Priam. That they would call it all this shit. It's deranged. And then
the treasure of Helen. That's what
like
wait,
if you
wait
go
for this part.
Anyway, so he covered there's a picture. If you look him up, I think it's even on the Wikipedia page. If you look him up, there's a picture of his wife at the time, who was like a 16-year-old blonde Greek woman he found named Helen, and he was like, oh my God, like it's bad. It's like bad.
Holy fuck.
He like covered her in this jewelry and took a picture of her. So I guess it must have been in like the early 1920s. Okay.
Stranger than
fiction.
fiction.
And he was like, oh my God, we found the treasure of Priam. We have now since dated that, and we think that was dated to like 1,000 years pre when the Trojan War would have happened, that jewelry.
Oh wow.
That's
So
nuts.
he dynamited actual Troy, which is great.
That's so upsetting. Okay, I found the picture. Yeah. No. Oh no. Everything is bad.
It's not good. It's not good. Yeah, if you ever want to get upset, look up what Sir Arthur Evans did to Knossos on Crete.
Yeah, actually, when we did our Minos episode, I did fall into that rabbit hole, and I'm like, I got to put a pin in this because I'm about to lose my mind, and we're about to start recording. I can't keep digging, but I'm freaking out.
Absolutely bananas. But this
Iliad.
This is also part of a greater, like, honestly, recognizing all of this though is important in, I think, the field of classics and archaeology, because they as fields of study have existed for a really long time, but a lot of them are sort of founded on the opinions of old white aristocratic men who were just fucking around and being like, oh my God, they were just like us. So
interesting.
You have to kind of really start to see where a lot of, like, especially like British Empire imperialism.
Oh my God, he just like me for real.
Hashtag it me.
Yeah, so it's really important to start to unpack a lot of the biases they brought into their research. Yeah,
wonderful.
Which is always fun. The plus side is that work is happening now, slowly but surely, which is great.
Yay.
Yeah, anyway, so that's the site we think might have been Troy. And they did find evidence of a battle that would correspond in the dating. They found evidence of, like, the city being destroyed. So we think there was maybe a war.
Maybe.
Were all of these dudes there? Who's to say?
Who's to... Oh, Homer, apparently.
Who's to say?
DJ.
What's up?
You should go first. What questions you have for Emily about the Iliad?
Who's your favorite character?
Oh.
Ooh, that's if you mean character in terms of, like, who do I like the best?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's that's generally what the
no.
question
You can
entails.
have who I like the best and then who I think is the most interesting character.
Yeah, this is
when I
a
say
problem I run
favorite,
into
I
on
mean
Monster
like.
Donut, where Phoebe and I, one of our favorite characters is Luke, but that doesn't mean we like him. It just
I
means
guess
we
both
find him
then.
really interesting.
Then apply your definition of... Well, DJ's definition of favorite is whom one likes the best. So
Typically.
So
I think Hector's my favorite.
oh man, I'm so sorry.
No, understandable.
Not that I'm sorry that you like Hector. I'm sorry for what happens to Hector. That's a bummer.
Yeah, I mean, and as far as, like, most interesting character, I think Achilles obviously is the most interesting character.
Mm-hmm.
But I like Hector. He's a very interesting character. And I feel like a lot of people don't portray him the way I feel like is the best. Because I think, so one of the really interesting things about the Iliad that really sets it apart from other texts, including the Odyssey, is the fact that there, like, aren't good guys and bad guys in it, which is crazy considering how old it is.
Yeah.
Because I feel like a lot of the time when we see epic poems and stuff, there's always, like, a definitive evil, definitive monster. And the Iliad, I think one of the reasons why it's so timeless is there just isn't one. There's no, like, because in reality, the people who would have lived at Troy would not have spoken Greek.
Yeah.
They were probably Indo-European, which meant they probably would have worshipped similar gods and been enveloped in a very similar Mediterranean trade network. They would have all been connected because we think Troy would have been situated right around the entrance to the Black Sea from the Mediterranean, which would have been a really important trading port. They would have been foreigners to the Greeks.
Oh.
At this time. And yet, in the Iliad, they are not depicted as other.
Mm-hmm.
Which is really interesting. And in that way, it's just, I feel like Hector as a character is such an interesting character because in so many ways, he is sort of the ideal. Like he is, especially as a modern audience person, like he like genuinely cares and has heart for like the women in his life, his children. Like he's a very like well-rounded, caring, very empathetic person who he's not like making war for no reason. Like he's protecting his city. Like he has like the purest motives of almost any character.
Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting. And also in the Iliad, the other interesting thing about him is it kind of comes and goes because the way the Iliad is written, it's written for a Greek audience. But there's a version of the story in which you can portray both Hector and like Achilles, Agamemnon, Menelaus, all of them equally feeling as though they are the ones ordained by the gods to be the winners in this conflict. Like they're the ordained heroes of this conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is ultimately Hector's doom is he thinks he's the main character.
Oh, Hector. I'm so sorry. You don't have that plot armor.
And then, his tragedy is realizing he isn't. Like there's all this talk of fate and death. There's all this talk of fate in it. And he says something really interesting when he kills Patroclus. Where Patroclus is basically like, Achilles is coming for you after you're going to die because of this thing you did. Mm-hmm. And he's like, who's to say? Who is to say? Like, he's the one that's really questioning fate throughout the piece.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know. He's just a cool, he's just a good guy. Hector TM is sort of my like thing. And then the scene between him and his wife at the beginning of the Iliad is also just so touching. And like, it's just such a good, like, you know, you just like really establish him outside of war in a way that you don't really see the other characters established.
No, and that's, I think, really interesting that it's like Hector feels like he should be the hero of the piece, especially when you're like, well, it's like, oh, we have like Agamemnon, who is the worst, and then Achilles, who's like is supposed to be like our hero, question mark, but he also literally tells his mom, a goddess, to go tell Zeus to let his people start to lose because he's got beef with Agamemnon and his pride got wounded. And Hector's over here just trying to keep everyone in his city from being slaughtered and like all the women and children from being like taken as slaves, and yet he dies and gets his body dragged around the walls of the city he sought to protect because Achilles let his boyfriend use his armor to try to scare the Trojans, and then Zeus got Patroclus to go farther back to the walls. What does that say about this piece? Like, when that happens, like, what is... How do you... I guess the what happens to Hector when he feels like he's maybe, like you said, like, good guy Hector, like, what is... In the context of the... It just seems so upsetting in the context of the kind of stories that we here in like the US are used to getting. But what would that have maybe felt like for someone in this era who's hearing the story? Like, would that have been so distressing, or would that have been like, par for the course, it's what the gods wanted, sorry, man?
Yeah, I mean, the people listening to it would have been rooting for the Greeks.
Yeah.
They would have been rooting for the Greeks. They would have probably also been pretty familiar with the story of Achilles. So I feel like this almost is like a bit of a subversion in that. In Emily Wilson's like introduction to her translation, she said something kind of interesting about this. She was talking about how like almost everybody who would have been listening would have already known this story.
Mm-hmm.
But that the Iliad in particular, and why she as a translator really feels compelled by it, is it's the narrative of it is so like, even if you know how it's gonna go, it's so like it really tricks you sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Like it really like it's sort of like, I think almost in a way like Hadestown is too, where it's
I was like, about to say Hadestown.
Yeah, where it really like, again, you just every time you hear it, you know, you hit a certain point where you're like, how is this going to go the way I know it's going to go? There's no
why
way.
Won't it go different? Yeah.
And I think it does such a good job of like creating all of this drama, creating all of the stuff that's going to keep you on the edge of your seat, even if you know how it ends.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like I lost your question.
I think you did explain it, where it's like they know how it ends, and it's like they're rooting for the Greeks, and just like it doesn't faze them necessarily for it to be this way. This is just the way it is, but it's still a story worth telling even if you know the ending because of the complex characters, because of the way it goes.
And also the greatest theme of the Iliad, in my opinion, is because the thing about the story in and of itself is it's not about a glorious war. It's not about a triumph. You know, I think a lot of people, you mentioned this, it's a lot of people have a very different idea of what's actually in the Iliad than what is actually the story. You know, like the movie Troy, for example, it takes the Iliad story, but it puts a spin on it. I think it gives it a much more like modern, like contemporary to us narrative, where there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And those are based around plot events, right? So that begins with the abduction of Helen and the start of the war. The middle is the war, and then it ends with the sacking of Troy. And I think a lot of people, because to us, that's how we tell stories now. That's our idea of what a story is. So we wouldn't assume that it would be any different in the text. But actually, the Iliad itself is not really a story about a war. It's a story about all of these characters trying to earn glory for themselves in a world in which they all know they will die and be forgotten.
Oh.
So in a way, it's sort of them struggling for the only version of immortality they can get, which is fame. You know, people still saying your name, however, later. And that's why fame, glory, and all of that is so important to all of the characters.
Because it's the only way to essentially escape death.
Yeah.
That they know is coming for him. When you have Achilles who knows from the jump that when Hector dies, you're going to die next. Like, that is the prophecy that they're all playing under, and everyone's got that.
Yeah. And Achilles, I think, to an ancient Greek, would still be a very extreme example of that. Everything in glory is tied to you. It's like, it's not just, you know, doing a great deed. It's also like the spoils of war you win.
Yeah.
So like all of the prizes he gets and all of that stuff, you know, that is all part of it. So there's a reason why he's so furious that Agamemnon would take, you know, part of the prizes he's won. And it's a deep existential threat to him because he as a character kind of represents this need for that. And that's why, like, it's such a big deal. It's not just, like, about, like, Briseis. It's about the deep existential threat of, like, taking the glory he's earned himself, which to him is a matter of life and death, like, living forever.
Yeah. Okay, well, those were literally my next two questions, which is the Iliad actually about the Trojan War? And what was Achilles actually so upset about? DJ, your turn. I have to think again. Emily's really good at this.
I love talking about the Iliad. I think about it all the time. This is my real Roman Empire.
It's gonna seem like a cop-out, but what's your favorite scene in the Iliad?
Oh, I mean, I think I already answered this, but I do think the sequence of the death of Patroclus and then the death of Hector. But I also really like. Honestly, I really like the scene at the beginning with Helen because depending on the translator especially and depending on your read, it's a completely different scene because she's written in a way there's sort of this deep inherent tragedy in her character and what's going on. And like, again, let's not like her name Helen, like the Hellenes are the Greeks. That's how you say Greek in Greek.
Oh,
interesting.
So there's some.
So she's
there's
literally
a bit there
Greek?
of like
she's supposed to represent this culture of Greece.
Yeah, she's definitely kind of a symbolic character, but there's this really interesting scene where she, you know, because the Trojan War in the story is essentially started because of her, in that Paris took her, and it's ambiguous if she went willingly or not, but it kind of seems like it wasn't willing, and yet she's sort of consigned to it because it was the will of a god. Like, she's not sitting there pining for Menelaus, but she's also not really happy to be with Paris either.
Yeah, understandable.
And so there's a scene where Priam, the king of Troy, is asking her to, like, pick out all of these great Greek commanders, and she's going through them all and talking about them, and then she talks a little bit about, like, you know, how she feels about everything. And again, it's just, like, a very different scene depending on who's writing it.
Yeah,
was reading it.
Feel like it'd be really easy for certain translators to bring a bias to their portrayal of Helen.
Yeah, and I will say this scene in the Emily Wilson version I really enjoyed. I think a lot of the scenes with the women, because I feel like a lot of translations I've seen.
Why.
Yeah, I know,
wonder what's different.
Gee, I wonder. Could it be the first woman translation of the maybe?
Wild. It took so long. It came about maybe in 1100 to 800 BC, and yet this long.
Yeah, but there's an interesting ambiguity in the text where I think it's neither. And I feel like that makes for a really interesting moment. There's also this like deep inherent tragedy in the scene because she's pointing at all these commanders and then she's trying to find her brothers and she can't. And she's like, oh, I wonder where they are. And then in the narrative voice, she doesn't know. It says she did not know that they were both already dead. Like neither of them even made it to Troy.
That's so sad. Yeah. I am so sad.
It's just like a lot of really, there's just like so, it's just, you know, it's so good. There's just so much inherent tragedy in every like part of the Iliad that really just like creates this tapestry of human experience, especially human experience in war, human experience in this struggle. And it's just so sweeping and good. It just like creates this like really it just like there's so many really interesting character moments and character studies in it.
That's so good. Since we brought up Helen, I did just want to real quick mention that today, B. Fitzgerald, author of Girl, Goddess, Queen, announced that her second book is going to be a sapphic reimagining of Helen and Cassandra during the Trojan War.
Okay, I'll take it.
And that's just me getting to mention Girl, Goddess, Queen one more time this season at the very least. My favorite book of the year.
But, we love sapphic Helen. We love sapphic everything.
Exactly. No, here for it. But specifically, so with Helen, you talk about like how she can be a very ambiguous character, and that's probably like the intent. But so often you've had translators who just outright vilify her. And she's often referred to as the woman who caused the Trojan War. So I want to ask you, Emily, who is responsible for the Trojan War?
Oh, boy.
And why is it Zeus?
It is, I mean, I think it goes so far back. I'm trying to even remember. I literally just reread it. I mean, the thing with the Trojan War is there's so many, it's the gods is what I will say, are the cause of it. Like, that's my actual answer.
Yeah,
but
sure.
Yeah. No,
you just keep moving back and back and back. And honestly, I think it's an interesting, like, honestly, it's a good metaphor or, like, reference for the importance of, it's a good, an interesting way to think about how wars start in general. Honestly, it's a good shorthand touchstone mythological, like, what's the word I'm looking for? Analog? What?
Analog sounds right.
An analysis?
Archetype? No, not archetype. Analog sounds metaphor? Simile. Those are not it. I'm just saying words now to hopefully jog the correct word.
I think it might be analog.
Analog sounds good to me, honestly.
Who's to say? I don't know. But it's this thing where it's Helen's fault if you're zoomed as far in as you can get, right? Where she went with Paris and her left on a ship with treasure also that was stolen from Menelaus, violating guest rights. Paris violated guest rights and took her. And the Trojan War began because Helen was so beautiful that when she married Menelaus, her father feared that anybody who would marry her would immediately be besieged by anyone else who'd wanted to marry her. So they forced them all every leader in Greece, essentially, who wanted to marry her to form a pact where if somebody ever claimed Helen, they would all unite and get her back for whoever she picked or whoever ended up marrying her. I can't remember how much agency she has in the original myth.
I would bet 0.
And she ends up marrying Menelaus. And then years later, Paris leaves Sparta with Helen, though they all are honor-bound to go besiege Troy. But we zoom out a level, right? Paris has violated guest rights. Paris maybe stole Helen. Maybe she didn't go willingly. But at the end of the day, it doesn't super matter. And in an ancient Greek society, women were not super fully seen as people. So, like,
But, I mean, based on the myth of Pandora, they might not have been people, but they were blamed for everything that went bad.
Oh, yeah, for sure. They're the property with a brain. Dang. The mind of their own. And then you zoom out again, and it's like, well, why did this even happen? Why did Paris think he could take Helen? And then you get the myth of the wedding and Eris with the golden apple and the three goddesses. And it turns out Aphrodite actually promised Helen to Paris, despite the fact that she was already married, and all of this other stuff was going on. And then you can zoom out again and again, and there's just all of this stuff where, like, if you're looking at immediate context, sometimes individual people or things can seem like they're the real problem. But the more you zoom out, the more you realize it's the entire system that's the problem that created this.
Oh, yeah.
And I do think in the Iliad, the spirit of the Iliad is very much it's a mortal war, but it's very much a war between the gods and the mortals.
Yeah, we break away to hear the gods like plotting and conniving and talking about like their histories and stuff all the time. Apollo shows up on the battlefield.
Yeah.
And fucks with Patroclus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
hey, there's another question I have. How do we, and DJ, we speak on this too. We touched on this a little bit in the last episode, but we didn't like deep dive into it. Here in this very valuable text of inspiration for Greek mythology and the retellings and the stories we build off of now, leaning a little bit into our modern pop culture thing, we actively have not just gods always around, but a god literally on the battlefield, resulting in the outcome of this like man's life. Why do we think Rick Riordan decided the gods can't get involved full splat period?
Well, there's a bit of a feeling of like the gods. There's a moment in the Iliad where Zeus sort of forbids the gods from getting involved.
Was that before or after Patroclus died?
It's before.
Apollo, what the fuck?
Well, Apollo's about to try to overthrow Zeus here in the 1,000 years.
There's a period like earlier on in the Iliad where Zeus was like, no one get involved. And then yeah, it's an interesting question. I do feel like it's a thing where I'm trying to remember if I got this from Rick. Like, because here's my problem is a lot of, like, sometimes I'll be sitting here like, why do I have this impression of a myth? And then I'll realize it's from Rick Riordan.
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes it's not. But I do think generally that probably, I feel like that's probably a product more of how our societies have evolved to think of gods.
Okay.
Because if in the Iliad, the gods are sort of depicted as being ever present. Something else that's kind of interesting about it is they not only are they popping in and out all of the time, but, as you might, again, I think it's easier to think of them as separate from what they represent in English because we call them by their names versus a lot of the gods, their names are just the thing they represent. Mm-hmm. Like Deimos and Phobos literally just mean like fear and terror, so you're not saying Deimos and Phobos are running around. You're saying fear and terror are running around in between all these people. You're kind of personifying a lot of the things the gods represent and their emotions. And honestly, like most of their names are really archaic forms of what they are. Mm-hmm. Not all of them, but many of them. So there's this kind of feeling in the Iliad of like the gods are sort of running rampant wherever what they represent is present. Mm-hmm. Versus I feel like more and more as religion became a lot more codified and a little more potentially distant as our societies developed, then we sort of think of them as beings more than necessarily forces, if that makes sense.
Yeah, forces. They're just kind of, I'm doing a thing with my hands. My listeners can't see that. I'm going to put my hands down. Yeah, forces.
Yeah, it's like a floopy vibe thing,
A vibe thing. Yeah. They're just vibes. And everyone's failing the vibe check.
And so I think that contributes to it because I think in our worlds, we're generally coming from, at least in America, a pretty overwhelmingly Christian background for most people. Like I'm not saying most people, but like the way our society is built is definitely built on like Christianity in America. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the West is kind of built on that too, because that's just like how the cookie crumbled. So I think the way we think of God in terms of the Judeo-Christian God is a little bit different than the way the Greeks thought of their gods in many ways. But I think also there's this idea of God having a lot more agency and forethought than is necessarily true to, especially like the more old stories of ancient Greek gods. So I think that's part of it. And I think also like our relationship to gods have changed a lot for that reason. So you see a lot, like, again, I'm going to bring up Troy. Like, there's this whole monologue the character Achilles does in the movie Troy, where he says, the gods envy us because we can die. No Greek person would believe that. There's a lot of lines in the Iliad that are like the opposite of that. Like, the moral characters being like, alas, I am what I am because I die and because I am not one of the gods.
Yeah.
You know, there's so many lines in it where they're like,
the gods don't want to die.
the gods don't have to deal with this bullshit because they're gods.
Yeah.
I wish I didn't have to deal with this bullshit, but I do. But I think that speaks to like our modern kind of idea of what gods are and how they are, because there's a lot more agnostic people. There's a lot more people for whom religion isn't like part of their worldview necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
That's more of a cultural thing than, you know, how you think of everything. So there's a lot more rejection of that and a lot more embracing of agency.
Yeah. It reminds me of the thing you learn in like middle school social studies when you're learning about ancient Egypt. And it's like, oh yeah, there wasn't like a word for religion because that was just so a part of the Egyptian culture when you're learning about the myths and stuff. And that's the most basic, mild, like, middle school social studies way to explain it. But it is, I think, an element that is difficult for us here in like the US today to comprehend, of these like the gods and these forces being so deeply intrinsically linked, almost the same way you'd think of like gravity.
Oh yeah.
Or like literally the laws and mechanics of physics is how they were there.
My favorite example is the winds.
Ooh.
Because, like, you know, me studying Greek mythology as a kid, you're like, oh my god, the winds, they have different names and different personalities. That's cute. That's quirky.
Yeah, neat.
And then I spent a semester in Greece, and I remember waking up one day, and I look outside, and there's just, like, this pink dust just hazing the entire, like, gathering in people's cars. And I was like, what is this? This is crazy. And I've never lived by a desert or anything, so there's that. But then, you know, you'd ask people, like, what's going on? They'd be like, oh, that's the south wind. And I'd be like,
that's
what?
Just normal for you people?
What do you mean that's a south wind? And then, like, cut to, like, a few weeks later, you're like, why the fuck is it so cold? These blasts are coming out of nowhere. And they're like, yeah, it's the north wind.
Yeah.
And you're
like,
like,
they're just there.
And it's just like, oh my god, the winds are real? Like, you know, like, it's not just, like, fun, cute, quirky, like, we gave them personalities for funsies. It's like, no, if the wind blows from the south in Greece, it's going through the Sahara, so it's hot, and it's carrying all this sand with it. And that's what the dust is. And if it's coming from the north, it's coming from the Balkans, which are cold as shit. And so it's going to be cold as shit. And it's just like, oh, okay.
Interesting.
It's like seeing a solar eclipse or like a volcano, like the lava dancing in a volcano for the first time, when you're just suddenly like, oh, that's what they were seeing. Mm-hmm. That's what they were interacting with. That's what they had no understanding, or they couldn't say, oh yeah, it's coming from the Sahara, and now it's like, and it's coming from the Baltic, and it's cold. It's just, no, sometimes it's that way and it's stupid cold, and sometimes it's this way and there's sand everywhere. I don't know, that's just the way it is.
Yeah. It's like you're reading through things, it's like, oh, and then Boreas blew a sharp gust, and you as an ancient Greek person be like, yeah, of course, that's the north wind. Like,
got cold.
That's what that feels like. Yep.
Yeah,
that's happened to me. That was like one of the biggest mind fucks of being in Greece, by the way, just being like, the winds are real.
The winds are real. That's the pull quote. I think it's nothing about the Iliad. That's the caption at the top of the show notes, is the winds are real, with a little intro bang.
Yeah.
No, I think that's such a interesting, the oh yeah, happened to me being like a response to hearing these stories of like, and then Apollo, you know, smacked him on the head, and he's like, yeah, happened to me. I've had that happen. Yeah. Son. They just get you sometimes. Yeah. No, that's not a god getting involved the way we would think about it. It's not Jesus showing up to like fisticuffs your uncle or something. It's like, no, I got heat stroke. Yeah, it happened to me.
Yeah, if you ever like shot an arrow and then it didn't go where you wanted to go, be like, man.
Like, happened to me. Yeah.
Fucking Apollo.
It's hashtag relatable. Everything about the Iliad is hashtag relatable. Actually, maybe that's the name of the episode. Hashtag relatable. Just not to you.
Just not to us.
Except some things are.
Yeah.
That's what it is. Some things are the discrepancy of wanting to like fight for your family or be remembered. And sometimes that like selfish desire for your own like need for some sort of security in your mortality can override the common good. But then if your common good is wanting to sack a city to get back this lady who may or may not have left just her husband, like, why are you even here? I didn't want to marry Helen. Why am I fighting this?
Yeah, it's because you're fighting for glory. You're fighting for the fact that this is going to be a historic event and you're going to be a part of it. And that's the only way to be remembered.
Yeah, and that's also when we think about just kind of stepping back and like the Iliad as a piece of media, essentially, that was created and composed by people, would you say that this was reflecting beliefs that were already in the culture, or was it something that established the beliefs that we see reflected in like that, like honor and glory, like the Greek heroes who are the worst people I've ever met in my entire life sometime, but are heroes because glory and their story is told?
I think mostly the former, but both.
Oh.
Because, this is where we get into some cool linguistic stuff a little bit.
Yay!
Which you'll be like, what do you mean? I didn't ask you a question about linguistics. Yes, you did, actually.
Yes, I did. I did, actually. Yes, I totally did. We all heard it.
So one of the really interesting things about the Iliad and the Odyssey is there are some of the oldest written Greek we have.
Oh.
And it's old. Like, what that means is as soon as you write something down or you codify something in a way that does not naturally change, like languages naturally change and evolve, then you have a record not only of the story, but like what the language the story was written in was being used at the time. And again, the Iliad and the Odyssey are not amazing examples because, like I said, they're written kind of weird. Like they're not written in a way people were actually talking. What we do have in them are codified certain poetic devices. And I'm saying the word device. I think when you think of a poetic device, you think like simile, metaphor, like big picture stuff. In this case, it's not so much, we call them devices, but they're more like stock phrases. So there's a few of them that are in the Iliad that are actually really important in the Indo-European linguistic field, which is the field of study of the languages, not only of ancient Greece, but of all of the sort of sister branches of those languages. So that's Latin, that's Celtic languages, German languages, Anatolian, aka Turkey. Like Hittite is one of them, all the way through like Sanskrit in India and like Tocharian, and a bunch of others. You see these phrases being passed down in a certain specific way, and we see them in multiple language branches with the sound changes of the languages, but nothing else really changed. So you're able to see like cognate phrases, like not just words, but like whole phrases in the poetry of these works. And we've got a few that we know because we see them in both like the Rig Veda and which is the big Sanskrit text, and like the Iliad, that they had to come from a common source. And one of those is kleos. In the Greek one in Greek it's kleos aphthiton, which means undying glory. It has a cognate phrase in Sanskrit that we have, and others. Another one is calling a poet like a weaver of words. So like those kind of linked ideas. Another one that's interesting is like he slew the serpent, like slaying a serpent, like killing a dragon, like the dragon slaying myth. That's all, like specifically slew. That verb is cognate in English with a bunch of others, in like Greek, for example.
Oh.
Which I can't remember off the top of my head. But that's in like the hymn to Apollo. That's also in the Bellerophon story in Greek mythology. So there's a few like things we know we can date all the way back to like Proto-Indo-European, like which we put proto in front of the word to be like, we know this language probably existed, but we have no actual evidence of it existing.
But probably maybe, yeah.
Probably maybe. So because we know they had to have a common ancestor, we know that existed. So we know that something like an idea like undying glory had to exist in a common ancestor between Sanskrit and Greek.
Oh, yeah.
And so we know that poets then were probably talking about this that early on. And that this idea encoded in these words, in this phrase, has been passed down.
So we just know that concept is there and has been for a very long time.
Yeah. And is like probably culturally significant to these societies.
DJ, I'm going to volley it too. We haven't gotten a question from you for a hot second.
Because I don't have any questions.
No, you've been asking. You've been asking, but you've been asking like great ones. Yeah, I love that. I think that's great. I think that keeps us grounded a little bit more into like,
What's your favorite like overarching fact? Like it doesn't have to be directly like from this wording of the Iliad, like just something you know about the Iliad. It could even just be in the Iliad. Favorite fact about the Iliad.
Oh man, how big do you want? Like small one or like
no, like just like over like
the thing you'd be so excited to share with us.
A cave or just like something that like you know about the Iliad that nobody else knows that you love.
And by nobody else, he means us, not like, the people in your field. You all know this.
That's hard. I mean, most things are my favorite thing about the Iliad.
You are an Iliad person, so I suppose that makes sense.
I was gonna say I do have Kleos Aphthiton tattooed on me, so that probably that phrase. Something else that's kind of interesting about that particular phrase, though, is so Achilles is from a place called Phthia, which is really annoying if you're not used to pronouncing it, but it's spelled Phthia.
Yeah, I definitely said it wrong in the last episode. Sorry, gang.
Yeah. It's weird. You like have to just say it
Phthia?
And believe that it'll work. Phthia.
Phthia. Cool.
Yeah.
All right.
Phthia. Sorry. Phthia.
I didn't move on from that.
So Kleos means glory. Kleos. And Phthia. Apphthiton. It's a noun. Phthia is the place. Apphthia. So it means imperishable, like Apphthia. Like so the A in front makes it im. So Achilles is literally from a place like called like perishable. Like Achilles' homeland is like the place that is doomed to wither away forever. Versus what he is seeking.
Imagine naming your town something like that. It's so crazy to me.
That's the kind of thing that if you wrote it in like a creative writing class and turned it into your teacher, they would say it's too on the nose.
Yeah, well, that's the thing though. Is like a lot of this stuff is a lot more on the nose than you would think. Like that's what I mean about the gods' names and stuff too. Like, you as an average ancient Greek person, you're not going to have to like look at like a dictionary or this. You're not going to have to like have a running list of characters. You're gonna be like, oh yeah, that's a metaphor.
I got it. I know what that means. Yeah, that's happened to me.
Yeah. I just think that's really, and again, it really solidifies like the intent of the work and like what it's really about. Like Achilles' entire character, he's a larger than life character in a sense that most of his struggle is deeply existential in a way that is maybe not the most quote unquote realistic or grounded, but in a way that's very real and like important metaphorically.
If I call Achilles a drama king, am I right?
Correct. Yes, 100%.
Thank you. Okay, please continue.
100%. Another interesting fun fact about the language of the Iliad is a lot of people so the first word of the Iliad is maenis, which means, maenin, it's in the accusative, which is the word for wrath, but specifically divine wrath.
Oh.
It's a word that only gods usually get described with. Because there's a difference between being angry and like divine wrath. And so a lot of people, when they're translating it, refer to it as divine wrath, but it's one word in the actual Greek. And that also sets up the story where we begin the story with a sentence talking about the divine wrath of Achilles. Like he has transcended like mortal emotion.
Yeah. Emily Wilson translates it as cataclysmic wrath of great Achilles, which is a choice.
Yeah, actually, cataclysm, that's a Greek word. That's from Greek. Kata is like a prefix in Greek of like against, like.
Oh, so she was making a hashtag choice there.
Oh, yeah, 100%.
Yeah, that's just not... That's...
Any translator is going to have to make a decision about how they're going to translate main and many others. She actually made a few interesting choices for translation.
Any other stand out to you? Any other that you, not to create beef between you and Emily Wilson, but like any that you thought, well, that was maybe not how I would do it.
Well, I have actually translated some of this. So.
Yes, you have. It's awesome.
It's different. I don't know. I have a lot of thoughts. I really agree with her approach, and I read the introduction, and I was like, yeah, I really agree with how she was thinking about it. Honestly, one of my biggest things is I feel like, and it's going to be so personal to everybody who reads it, but I do feel like in classics generally, there is more of an emphasis placed on accuracy than there is on poetry.
Interesting. Yeah. That makes sense.
Like there's a certain cadence to the way you're instructed to translate things when you're learning them, purely because the teachers just want to make sure you know, like you're doing the right grammar, like you don't just get lucky. Because English grammar and Greek grammar is so different that there's like times when it could be ambiguous if you like actually knew what tense that verb was in. And so you're kind of have it ingrained in you to write it in a very specific way. And there's a few bits and bobs in Greek that, again, are really difficult to translate into English because like there's so many like particles and stuff that we just like don't have. And one of the reasons why the Iliad isn't amazing in English is because the Greeks, and she even says, I think talks about this in the introduction, like the Greeks have different words they have multiple words for certain things like weapons, body parts, and all of that make things feel less repetitive.
Oh.
Versus in English, like we've got one word, we've got helmet. Yeah. We got spear. Versus in Greek, there's two words for spear. You can call them either kalkos, which is bronze, which, first of all, how great is that word? Kalkos? Sorry, it's kalkos.
Emily correcting herself only for herself, because not a single person in this space would call her out.
Kalkos, which is bronze, but it means the tip of the spear. And then there's doros, which is like the shaft. Both mean spear, but depending on what part of the spear you're writing about, like...
you would use one or the other.
Yeah.
That's cool as hell. And that makes for great writing. Like, it's not repetitive, but you get it, and you hyper-focus on, like, what the
I'm saying this, like, there's point and shaft that we have in English, but it's just not...
That's
like,
not the
same. You still have to kind of clarify, like, of the spear, you know?
Yeah.
Although that being said, Doro still means, like... It also can mean, like, sapling. But, like, if you're reading the Iliad, they're not talking about sapling.
It's not a sapling. Yeah. Hey, Emily. So, like, what's the deal with Achilles and Patroclus? Like, are they dating or, like, what's going on there?
Yeah, this is, like, okay. So, the thing about the two of them, right, is it's impossible to say for sure what the original intent was because we just, like, don't have that nuance and understanding of social dynamics. So, this idea of them being like lovers emerged in terms of like quote unquote scholarship, in that like we have Plato in Plato's Symposium, for example, they talk about Achilles and Patroclus being ideal lovers. So again, that's like 400 BC, right? So it's like 400 years ish later to when they were written down, not necessarily told, but like written down. It is a significant period of time. Like 400 years is a lot. And I think a mistake you can make when looking at history is not thinking about ancient people the way you would think about modern people. So for us, 400 years ago was like the Renaissance. Like that's a significant amount of time and progress. And our societal attitudes towards things has immensely shifted so much since then. That being said, something else to contend with is the language barrier, because the fact is that nobody studying the Iliad and the Odyssey as a native speaker of ancient Greek. And I do think there's a lot to be said for the fact that there could be a lot more nuance in the wording and the way their relationship is depicted, where I would be more inclined to believe the account of people who were native speakers of Greek who are looking at this text.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Also, like, classics as a field has been pretty homophobic for a while, shockingly.
Yeah, there's that.
way.
There is that.
Like, for example, there's still people coming out with hot takes like, well, was Sappho really gay? And you're
What
like,
the fuck?
yes. Like, Greek has gendered pronouns. It's unambiguous.
Yeah. Like, no, she said it herself.
Like, it's not like Greek doesn't have gendered pronouns, you know? Like, no, she's saying she right there. She's saying she. Classics generally is pretty homophobic. They're generally more okay with the men being gay, the women being gay, I will say. But it's just really dicey and wishy-washy. Because, again, like I mentioned, there's sort of this weird foundation of a lot of the field. Also, like, internalized homophobia is a thing, too. Like, Erasmus is a pretty big scholar of Latin in medieval times, and he was, like, almost certainly, like, way gay. But, like...
But it was medieval times.
So he was a monk, you know?
Oh, my guy.
Yeah, so and so there's all of that of like, you know, ultimately, like, we are not people living in that time, so we can't say for sure what the cultural norms were. We can't say for sure if particular wording meant certain things. Like, maybe there's connotations there we just don't know. It's almost certain that there are. That all aside, what we do know about homosexuality in the ancient world, and again, what we do kind of know about it mostly comes from the classical period. Like, we don't have a lot of stuff from, like, we have most of the texts we have from the Mycenaean period are just like records. Like, we don't really have stories from there. We don't really have like people writing about their lives.
Yeah.
We can kind of look to other peoples in the area. Like, the Egyptians wrote a lot, which is nice. They're a great resource. But,
they wrote everything down.
Yeah, but they're also like a different society.
They're also, they're doing different things. It's not the same.
But what we do know, at least culturally in Greece by the classical period, is in terms of like homosexuality, there's a lot more importance placed on, for lack of a better way to phrase it, who was on top than like if the gender of the person you were having sex with. There are a lot of power dynamics and societal dynamics associated with that. The way Achilles and Patroclus' relationship is portrayed is interesting because
they're both switches.
Yes.
Oh. Damn, okay, DJ, nice.
No, exactly. They're both at times doing things that would be perceived as quote unquote like womanly. Like, the way Achilles mourns Patroclus is kind of the way a wife mourns a husband.
Megs taught us about that during our last episode about Achilles doing all of the funeral stuff is a thing that a woman would usually do, and Achilles doesn't let fucking anyone else get involved.
Yeah. And there's all these lines of like Patroclus essentially like quote unquote like running Achilles' household in the Iliad. Like, there's a lot of that.
Someone had to run that man's household. He clearly wasn't running it himself.
And like, my interpretation of it as a person who's
so was Patroclus.
Clearly,
everyone was
at
at work. Yeah, because he wasn't moping and playing music in the tent. He had shit to do. Sorry, Emily.
Anyway, sorry. I totally missed what you were saying because I was just. I realized I was talking. I'm so sorry. DJ especially is really quiet in my earbuds. So when I'm talking, I don't always hear you.
No, you're totally fine.
Most of what we have to say are jokes. So
I'm just goofing and gaffing.
Yeah, Patroclus is running the household.
Yeah, so there's a lot of that, and my interpretation. And again, I'm biased because I think they're gay. My interpretation of their relationship, though, is it feels very much like it's written as subtext, but there's a lot of also like, oh my god, no homo in there. But it's also like things that were expected as the norm. Like, again, sexuality was not viewed as like an either or situation, and it wasn't viewed as a like
yeah.
You had a wife
the language
to run your household, to have your children, blah 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 blah. They were your property versus like, I don't know, and like. As an ace person, I do appreciate that this could also be a representation of a truly deep platonic friendship. Like, it's not something I'm rooting against, you know, but also I, like, again, as an ace person reading this, I'm like,
No, yeah, it's another thing I wanted to, because it's like, I think they're gay, and very much want to celebrate, like, that like have to kind of fight against that instinct to be like, no, queer folks have existed and we didn't make them up in the Tumblr era. Like, we've always had these stories. They aren't something that can be hidden anymore. But simultaneously, like, also as like resonating with like being ace and wanting to see depictions of like deep platonic love being so celebrated and worth dying for and caring that deeply about. Does it, in your opinion, as someone who's like studied this text, does it actually really matter?
I mean,
like the nature, like if that nature, like, does it really matter if the relationship was this or this or this, like, to the story?
The answer is like yes and no. I think. Interesting. So again, because I just read it the most recently. Because Emily Wilson talks about this in her introduction to her translation also. She's like, because she cites them as friends in her translation, and she explains that it's because a lot of the language that Achilles uses in describing Patroclus is more of that of a parent-child.
Mm.
And there's also all
Interesting.
these instances of like it almost feeling like a spousal relationship at times. And I do think there's also this like great friendship and this dynamic duo. And you see like these great friendships in the Iliad. Like Diomedes and his charioteer, you know, they have this great deep friendship. Odysseus and Achilles have a great deep friendship. Like there's a lot of great deep male friendships in the Iliad. But I do think in the text, Achilles and Patroclus' relationship, for better or for worse, is intended to be transcendent because a huge piece of Achilles' storyline is grief. And it's dealing with mortality. And so Patroclus as a character, I think, inherently has the most weight as somebody who, as is said in the text, like means the most to Achilles.
Yeah.
And I think seeing them as having like the deepest possible relationship, whether that be to some that of a parent-child, that of romantic partners, that of like just truly deep friends, like I feel like that ambiguity also does give us an in wherever we are at in our own lives to that storyline. But I think like, especially in our current society, portraying them as lovers is the most powerful story because I think we also weigh romantic relationships the highest.
Yeah. And that is a bummer, but also to be able to demonstrate that quickly for audiences to understand the cultural stuff of like, this is what we're saying. Do you get it? Okay, we're moving on.
Yeah.
I also having that relationship be like the deepest, like you said, most transcendent for them. I think also just talking about it in this conversation makes me think how Achilles knows that he will die shortly after Hector. Or does he know? I know Thetis knows that. Does Achilles know that?
I think she tells him he'll die after Hector kills Patroclus.
Okay. And so his whole thing is like, I want to be like the whole thing. He's like holding out and fighting. He's glory, undying glory. Like I want to be remembered forever. And after Patroclus dies, he's just like, I'm going to kill Hector and I'm going to be done, which means he's like it feels like no longer necessarily worried about doing those things and stacking up the gold cards and getting the treasure and getting all that unending glory because you can't get that glory if you're dead. But he's just like, fuck it. I don't necessarily care about that anymore because I'm now like, if I don't know, reading it as like a realization that maybe unending glory isn't necessarily the thing that is actually most important to focus on in this life.
Yeah.
Like focusing so much on how you'll be remembered when you're gone maybe that actually didn't matter more than focusing on what you loved here and who loved you here.
Yeah, and I think that is very much on the one hand, the Iliad is sort of a meditation on that want for glory. It's also definitely an argument for that being the source to immortality. I think especially, again, this is a text that was written about people that were already long dead and long gone. So there's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in it.
Yeah.
Also, if you look at the Iliad as a narrative, like I said, it begins with the first word is the divine wrath of Achilles. And this is, I think, where we can also get into what's actually in the Iliad, because the story of the Iliad begins when a priest of Apollo comes. It's in the 9th year of a 10-year war. So they've already been going for so long. And then it starts with the priest of Apollo demanding his daughter back. Interesting bookend from the Greeks. Agamemnon giving her back, but then calamity ensuing because they're not going to give her back initially. Then Agamemnon relenting, king of the Greeks, but as kind of payment for asking him to do what was best for the entire people of Greece by sacrificing some of his glory, he punishes Achilles by taking some of his. And Achilles that's what the wrath is. It's about him getting some of his glory stolen. And then we see how his personal wrath and personal drive for glory is poisonous to his comrades and also ultimately to him through the storyline with Patroclus, because Patroclus essentially dies because he takes Achilles' place because Achilles refuses to fight still. And like you so much of the Iliad too is you see just like how much calamity is brought onto the Greeks that disagreed with Agamemnon. Like only Agamemnon really like wanted.
Yeah, they all told him, no,
back.
give the he's giving us treasure, just give him his daughter back, like it's fine. He's like, no. So Apollo's like, I'm gonna give you all disease, and they're like, no.
It is like how much calamity comes to pass, not on Agamemnon, but on the entirety of the Greeks. Like they almost all get wiped out.
Mm-hmm. Agamemnon gets to go home.
Yeah. Well,
I mean,
his wife kills him, but I don't know.
I mean, Commissioner kills him, and that's great. We love that, actually. I do like that he had to stay at war for 10 years, finally got to go home, and then his wife kills him for killing their daughter. Yeah. But for real.
So that storyline with Patroclus, though, is like he ends up, unbeknownst to him, relinquishing the person he cares about the most through his own like desire for glory, his own wrath, all of these really negative aspects of heroism. And then goes on a rampage of revenge, but it's not enough to repay what's been done.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally he kind of achieves his revenge, but it's hollow. And they mourn Patroclus. Book 23 is the funeral games.
Mm-hmm.
And then book 24, the final book of the Iliad, the way it ends is Hector's father goes to Achilles and begs him, again, father begging for his child back. He beseeches Achilles to that, and all of the processing Achilles has done, like with the funeral games and other stuff, him kind of coming to terms with the death of Patroclus. Also, like Patroclus, Klos is Kleos.
Oh. Wow.
Yeah, Patroclus means like glory to the father. Patros. Pater.
It's a little on the nose, don't you think?
Just a little. But then Achilles, through finally being mourning Patroclus and processing it, realizes, after being besieged, lets go of the anger, lets go of that, and gives Priam his son's body back. Like, that's the Iliad. That's the story. And a bunch of other stuff happens in between with people go on other journeys, but that's the central narrative. That's how it begins and ends.
That's so beautiful and sad.
I know, right? Like, that's how it ends. It ends with them being able to bury Hector. That's literally the last line.
Yeah, I think, okay, I'm going to just full on pull us out of talking about the Iliad. I think for this conversation, in this podcast, I think that's as miraculous and special as we're going to be able to get. Otherwise, we'll just keep Emily here for another 6 hours.
I'm happy to do it.
No, this is a monster donut.
I'm sure Jared will be happy to do it with you, but I'm sleepy.
No. So we are going to get into what this podcast is about, which is we got to talk just a little bit about pop culture. Emily, you've mentioned the movie Troy a couple of times. Mm-hmm. Do you, as an as an Iliad person, feel that the movie Troy is a good adaptation of the Iliad?
There are parts of it that I really like, and there are parts of it that I really don't like. I think a lot of it can be explained by the fact that one of the writers is one of the writers of Game of Thrones.
Well, yeah, okay. We see some vibes there.
Yeah. There's a lot of people getting killed off that don't happen in the myth.
What?
That's not
but
like
so
Game of
many
Thrones.
people die.
It's like aggressively straight, like, and also very secular. So the big change they make there's like several big changes they make, but like the biggest change is there's no gods in the movie. It's all...
Oh, that's really weird.
Yeah, there's no gods. Also, Patroclus is Achilles' cousin. That's like the two big ones.
Oh my god, it's like in Sailor Moon. Yeah, it's like, can't be gay, so let's make them cousins.
It's my cousin. It's like...
That's why I care about them so much. We're cousins.
Yeah. It's just, Eric Bana as Hector, and the way they portray Hector passes the vibe check. I think it's great. That part's great. And I do think they capture...
And Hector's your favorite, so that earns them a lot of goodwill, it sounds like.
I do think they really capture the spirit of the Iliad in a lot of the parts. Like, I think Achilles as a character and Hector as a character feel real to me. Agamemnon feels like a good portrayal of the character. Sean Bean's Odysseus, which is pretty funny.
Oh, no.
It's like the one movie he doesn't die in.
I was going to say, but Odysseus famously doesn't die.
And there are parts of it where I like understand what they were going for and how it kind of vibes with the Iliad, but it's also like, why are you doing it this way? No. Where they like, spoiler alert, but like Paris kills Menelaus in a duel, and like on the one hand, like in the movie, the point is Orlando Bloom's Paris. It's a great casting choice.
Wow. I've actually never. I should watch this maybe.
There's a lot of hot people in this movie. There's a lot
DJ,
of
that should be. Got to put it on the remyth. We definitely gotta.
We'll slap Troy on the remyth.
Fantastic.
Like Menelaus gets killed by Paris, but like in the movie, it's sort of like this thing. It's like, oh well, okay, the guy whose wife we're trying to get back is dead, but like we're still gonna fight because like that's not what this was about. Like that is in spirit of the Iliad, but it's also like what? Like there's some choices. Overall, I would give it like 4 out of 5 stars.
Oh,
If you want like a good sense of the vibes of the Iliad, also like the fight scene between Hector and Achilles in this movie, so good.
Sometimes an adaptation doesn't have to be accurate. Sometimes it just has to be vibes.
I'll take like 75% is accurate and 25% is wildly not. There's so many Greek myth stuff that's so much worse than that. Like,
The Last Olympian is like cited as this is the Iliad book.
yeah.
How is it? Other than they just fight and the Curse of Achilles is there and Selena and Clarice do their thing.
Yeah. So if you want to hear my full rant about this, I talked a lot about this on Monster Donut. There's a line in there where I think Prometheus, he's there, and he says, "This is your Trojan War." So like Rick clearly was like, "This is
intended."
I did the Iliad because there's a war.
But that's not the Iliad, as we talked about for most of this episode. That's not the Iliad.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, there's really not that many parallels. Like, the biggest, like, iconic part of the Iliad is, like, the wall.
Yeah.
Europe doesn't have a wall. Also, like, the Trojan horse, like, they don't do that.
Yeah.
So, like, is it, like, a direct adaptation and parallel? No. And I think, like, he does replay a lot of the myths in a lot of his books, but this one, it doesn't hit the beats also. Like, it only hits, like, a couple of the beats. It doesn't hit all of the beats of the Iliad.
Could you argue that Luke and Achilles maybe are hitting that beat of, like, oh, but Luke isn't going for glory or anything. He's just mad at his dad.
Kind of is, though. Like, he kind of is.
He kind of is, though?
He kind of is.
Elaborate.
So. His speech at the end of Lightning Thief is like eerily similar to a moment when Achilles is talking about glory. He really, like, just the fact that he wants to be able to carve out a place for himself in the world, that he wants to be able to, like, have agency and do things, like, that feels very reminiscent of Achilles. Maybe a more modernized version of Achilles.
But the vibes are there.
Yeah, and I do think, like, the way I interpreted the Iliad as a fight really between the gods and the mortals, it feels like more it vibes with The Last Olympian, where there's all these arbitrary rules and weird things going on, and the mortals are just kind of fending for themselves and just sort of hung out to dry. Like, all of that.
Yeah, the gods literally aren't there, as there's a siege on Olympus.
Yeah, so, like, all of that feels very Iliad-y.
It's like there's something, like in the Iliad, it feels like the gods... There is something more important to them than the lives of any of these mortals. And that's kind of reflected in The Last Olympian, where it's like there's something more important to the gods than the lives of any of their children.
Yeah, and they'll even, like, pop in and just kind of, like, mess with them, even though it's, like, their world at stake, too, where you're just like, what are you doing?
Dionysus, what are you doing here? We don't need to talk to you right now.
Yeah.
Are you helping? I don't think this is helpful. Go play Pac-Man. Leave Percy alone.
Yeah, there's also an interesting parallel. So in the Iliad, there's 2 times that Zeus weighs the scales. And one time sides with the Greeks, one time sides with the Trojans. And that is actually reminiscent of Ethan Nakamura.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So that is in there. And I feel like that was intentional, I think. Like, just because it happens twice in the Percy Jackson series too. Once in Battle of the Labyrinth and once in The Last Olympian.
Yeah.
Where Ethan Nakamura, like, kind of plays a pivotal role.
And doing that. Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And weighting the scales in opposite ways.
So yeah,
it's like they're there. The echoes are there. I feel like, though, the struggles are just also kind of different too. So that's where I think these kind of diverge.
Mm-hmm. Like there are beats that are there, but the overall theme isn't quite the same.
Yeah. Like I think if you get too caught up in the idea that the Iliad's about a war, you might think it's a parallel. Any war is a parallel to it, but it's like,
Nah, that's not it. I have one more because I'm not interested in going through all the other places that the Iliad appears in pop culture, unless DJ or you, Emily, have a favorite that you want to talk about.
Of nothing.
I'm trying to think if there's any. Like, what's pop culture?
Let's go 1600s forward because I've regularly cited Shakespeare shit. So,
what is considered contemporary, I suppose.
Do you want to hear an interesting fun fact?
Please.
There was a really long period of time, starting around I think the 1600s, in like Middle Ages, just like through the Renaissance, where these two guys each forged like a fake. Like, no, I was really at Troy. This is an on-the-ground account of what happened.
What? Like,
And
this is some found footage shit.
No, like, for a while, those two were considered, like, oh, no, but this is what really happened. Like, people took them more seriously than the Iliad or, like, other myths, which kind of had been lost at that point. Where they were like, no, this is what really happened to Troy. And they're like just made up. It like they weren't even like contemporary myths. They're like just some guys made them up. And it's amazing. It's like crazy.
It's like 300.
Yeah.
It's like Rick Riordan and Percy Jackson and the Olympians.
Just like, oh wow. Yeah, I was totally there. Yeah, it's honestly kind of like it's almost like the Demigod Files though, where it's like I wrote it down. Like I'm the scribe in Half-Blood.
Yeah. Oh my God. Oh, that's incredible.
It's like if The Lightning Thief was like like people thought it was a semi-historical like story version account, and then actually someone was like, no, I was there.
But I was there though. What? Okay, that's actually great. Yeah, no, that's a good comparison. Okay, one more thing I want to do. And we've actually haven't played this game in a really long time, but this is something in early episodes of the podcast that we would do. If you were going to tell an Iliad story, maybe not adapt the entire thing, but what would you want to do, and what medium do you think would be the best for doing it?
Well, I've already figured that out because
have you?
It's on the docket. It's not
the whole thing is an anime.
DJ wins.
That'd be good. Actually, what I would love to do is an opera, but like the real Iliad.
Elaborate. Expound.
Like, it starts and begins at the same place. There's no sacking of Troy.
This is it starts with the priest and ends with the funeral.
Yeah. It would be about the personal stories, but it would have to be like a Met commission because I want like that budget, you know, like
you need top of the line everything, the costumes.
I need like the walls of Troy to be on stage, you know, like I need horses. I need
we're talking real horses or puppet horses. This is a war horse situation. Real horses on the stage.
It's the Met, baby. They get real horses. They get real camels.
Bet. Yeah.
I just like puppets. The Julia Taymor directed version or something, which is somehow even more expensive. No, I mean, because the thing is, it's like a long story, so I feel like even a feature film can't cover it. Miniseries, the thing is, it's like, the thing about the Iliad is I feel like the best way to tell it is it's almost like a series of snapshots and moments that are grounded in this landscape. So I feel like doing it in a song form is really good because there's this sort of loosey-goosey quality with timing in songs where a single song can encompass a really long period of time or a single emotional moment stretched out. So I feel like the flexibility and like what to focus on and how much weight it's given is really good with theater type storytelling. And then feels also more true to the original format. Yeah. Being oral, people in front of you talking about it. And then also like having music and like having that added element to it. Again, kind of more true to the original format. And also just gives you that extra dimension of storytelling. So yeah, I've thought about this opera.
Yes.
Understandable.
I'm not surprised you thought about this. DJ, I know for a fact you haven't thought about this. You had anime on the pulse, though. I would love to hear.
I feel like there are a few media where anime is the wrong call, though.
This is true.
I mean, yeah. Don't get me wrong. I'm just kind of pulling it out because I think the medium of anime is just funny because you can get away with so much more.
Yeah.
I
You can get away
think
with so much in anime.
yeah.
You want it to be a goofy slice of life where Hector is truly just being the house man? Great, dude. Like Achilles shows up every now and again, but we're just following or not Hector, Patroclus.
Oh, Patroclus. Oh yeah,
Yeah.
he's taking care of
Yeah,
shit. Yeah.
We're just watching.
And Achilles just comes in to mope occasionally.
I feel like if you're going to do like the extended epic cycle as well with like all of the different stories, that would be good.
Oh yeah, just
That would be really fun. Now I'm getting a Hatalia vibe from what you're describing, where everything just kind of overlaps with each other and nothing is serious.
No. I mean, like, that's just one instance. Then you can have like a Berserk style where we're actually going through the fucking war.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
I think I'm definitely, I'm vibing with you saying. My instinct when Emily was talking and I was like, back in my mind being like, what would I do? I also am just very partial to the art form. Yes, please. But animation. I'm very partial to animation and what you can do in it. But I think specifically I would take a Star Wars Visions approach, wherein it's like, here is a 8 to 12 episode series. It is about the Iliad, but it is a different art style and a different storyteller taking sections from it and telling it as if you were almost like going back to that Homeric hymn style where you've got the different dialects and different poets were telling it. And maybe insofar that you have a version of Achilles who's wildly different than this other version of Achilles, but that doesn't seem dissonant because the art style is different. But you'd keep the same voice actors through it. And then just having, not even like, this is the X number of pages and this is X, but it is about ideas and themes rather than telling from start to finish, but still having it bookend with the priest coming for his daughter and then Hector's father coming for Hector's body. And but the middle isn't telling chronologically, it's telling vibes and zeroing on characters and visiting, really just like also an opportunity to collect a bunch of very talented storytellers to be like, what do you want to focus on in the Iliad, and giving them the opportunity to like pull at that and be like, I want to talk about Helen and what she was going through in this specific moment and not have to A to Z. We could just hang out with Phoenix for a while too if someone wanted to. I don't fucking know. That guy shows up more than once.
I like that a lot. That'd be great. Because I feel like, again, the cool thing with the Iliad is there's so much there. So like having a bunch of different voices telling the same story. I mean, that's also, again, very much in line with all these different poets telling it too. Like that's, that works for me. I like that a lot.
Thank you. All right, dear listener, absolutely tell us what medium and how would you want to tell a version of the Iliad? Because Troy's, as Emily said, apparently great, but it can't be the only one, so what else should we make? Let us know and we will make them.
I wouldn't say great. I would
Call
say like...
Net. You gave it 4 out of 5 stars, my dear.
Yeah, but it's like the missing star isn't just like almost perfect. It's like it's missing a fifth of what it needs. Like...
That's fair. No, that's fair. It's not a star. It's an internal organ.
It's like, why is this straight?
Or you're missing a kidney. Like I need something from you.
Yeah. Why is it straight? All right. Emily, thank you so much for joining us and giving us essentially what is a free college lecture. I've had a great time.
I hope you've had a good time.
Please plug some stuff. We've obviously mentioned Monster Donut a ton. That's going to be in the show notes, but where can the listeners find you? Because obviously they're going to want more of you. You know so much. You make so many good things.
Well, that's the thing. You can't really get to those things yet.
Well, where can they find them when they are real and they can get to them?
Let's see. You can find me on Twitter at 9EmilyLime. I'm sorry, X. You can find me on...
No, you can't.
Like, again, speaking of things that just like are ephemeral.
Fuck X. That branding sucks. You should have kept it Twitter, dude.
Find me on Twitter at 9 the number 9 Emily Lime 9 another number 9. It's a palindrome. I made it when I was a pretentious high schooler. It's fine. You can also find me on Instagram at Emily J Garber. You can also find my podcast at PJO Pod.
Yeah, they snagged the PJO Pod one, which was the brilliant
audacity.
No, for real, and no one even thought. And that's the SEO is Oh, that was brilliant.
Well, it also makes up for us being called Monster Donut. Like, that is
so
so hard.
good.
It's unsearchable.
Yeah. No, that's wise. Yeah, we're sitting here as the muses of myth because someone else on Instagram has muses of mythology. When we switch our name over,
Bastards.
they posted one time 4 years ago. I'm still.
You know what? It's
salty.
fine. No one's gonna type out the full word mythology anyway.
That's true. That'll pop up first. It's fine.
You'll
Thank
be
you,
like,
Emily.
you'll get MYTH. What the fuck comes next? So
Yep.
that's when you start having to sound it out. Even me, like, yeah.
Yeah. You just hope it auto-populates.
It does have my favorite, like, ancient Greek. Anything that's an ology is really fun to say in Greek because the gamma sound, like the G, it's like kind of a G, but also kind of a Y.
Yeah.
So it's like mythologia.
That's so fun. What a fun mouth sound.
It's just a fun mouth sound. It's like the chai, like Achilles' name in Greek is Achilleos. Like it's not
Achilleos.
Achilleos.
Fabulous.
It's just better.
Well, links to all of Emily's stuff will be in the show notes. Go follow her so you can hear her say things in Greek more. And wow, you know what I bet she never has to do? Ask her co-host, how do they say that? And you hear the co-host, let me look it up and then read the Wikipedia pronunciation guide.
No, what you hear is me going, oh, how do you say that? Hold on, I need to look up the ancient Greek spelling.
I'll just look up the phonetic alphabet and be like, oh, this is how I say that? Oh, great.
Great. Close enough.
This funny thing keeps happening now, though, where, like, someone will say a word, and whenever, like, we're recording, and they'll just look at me.
For your approval?
Not to be like, yes. The thing is, it's also, like, there's so many different ways they're pronounced. There's no right answer. It's like, are you talking ancient Greek? Modern Greek? Because those are different. Are you talking, like, old English, classical, Oxford from the 1950s pronunciation? Like, what are we talking? Modern? Like, what?
No, I'm gonna say you say Patroclus differently than I do. And the first time you said it in this episode, I had a panic where I'm like, oh no! And I'm just also had to be like, I just managed to start saying it without tripping over the consonants in the middle every time. I just have to continue to commit and not overthink.
Let's look up the Greek.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a short O. Yeah, it's Patroclus.
Hey! That's just
Patroclus.
That's the way they say it in Hades. So I just hear Hades Achilles saying his name, and I'm like, I can do it if I have a soundbite in my head.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I say Patroclus because that's just how I've heard it.
Mm-hmm.
But in ancient Greek, it would be pronounced Patroclus.
Oh, okay.
Patroclus. Yeah.
Emily, thank you so much for educating us on just all the things. This has been absolutely fabulous.
Well, thank you for letting me talk your ear off. I love the Iliad.
Yay!
I still feel like I've barely scratched the surface. Like, there's so much.
No, I know. It truly, we have to. Buzzsprout only lets us upload so much audio a month, so we have to leave. Listeners, thank you so much for listening. Go tell Emily all the amazing things you learned and how fun it was as you follow her, and then listen to Monster Donut if you're not already, which you should. It's good.
Yeah, we do a lot of analysis, literary analysis-y, stuffy stuff.
It's very cool. We will be back next week to finish off season 5 with talking about Mount Olympus.
It's going to be a lot of fun, y'all. And hey, do not forget to go to patreon.com/Muses of Mythology, and you get a bunch of wonderful bonus episodes every other Thursday. Mm-hmm. We have a lot of fun in them. Is it every other Thursday or is it every other Tuesday?
No, it's supposed to be, but like it hasn't.
Well, we've been getting by, but we've been at the very least uploading.
You get bonus episodes that are promised.
You get 72 bonus episodes. How amazing is that? Also, coming up in the next month, we got Muse Myth. It's coming back. You better believe it. I'm very excited for it.
12-part daily series.
And you are going to get the first one here on your favorite podcatcher. The second one's going to be free on our Patreon when you join for free. And then every other episode is going to be available for every tier that is paid. You'll get 10 episodes on top of the 2 free ones. It's going to be great. Be there or be square.
Thank you again, Emily. Listeners, thank you so much. And until next time, don't be like Zeus.
Don't be like Zeus.
Muses of Mythology is created and hosted by Darien and DJ Smart. It's edited by Darien Smart. The show is produced by Darien and DJ Smart, as well as
Tim O'Connor, The Crystal Con Man, Nicholas Miller. Our music is Athens Festival by Martin Hay.
and our cover art is by Audrey Miller. You can find her on Instagram at bombshellnutshellart.
Want more Muses of Mythology? Support the show on Patreon. Just $1 gets you exclusive bonus content. Get more at patreon.com/Muses of Mythology.
You can also support the show by leaving a review at lovethepodcast.com/Muses of Mythology, or tell a friend why you love the show.
Don't forget to check out all of our episodes and episode transcripts at musesofmythology.com.
Thanks for listening.